Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, Diligent, PwC, Center for Audit Quality, Spencer Stewart, the Conference Board, and corporate board member, along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, the CEO of Boardroom Resources and the co-founder and editor-at-large of Corporate Board Member magazine. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. We're here filming in the New York studios of the Conference Board. We've got a great show today. Today we're going to be talking about the U.S. Chamber offers views to the SEC proxy roundtables, and joining me is the appropriate person who actually was part of that process. Welcome Tom Quaadman, who's the Executive Vice President, Center for Capital Markets Competitiveness at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Welcome back, Tom.
Thanks, TK. Good to be back.
Well, it's always a pleasure, and this was particularly interesting because we sort of heard some views last week from the investor side, okay, and from Ken Bertsch. He actually didn't, I don't think he spoke at the roundtables.
I don't believe so,
but he was certainly part of putting together the position that investors had. So we thought it was only fair that we want to get and hear the views on what I'll call the business side of this process. So let me start though by, Tom, there's so much happening. I mean, that has to draw your attention. We've seen sort of proposals come out of the Senate about fairness and governance and all that. We've seen Senator Warren propose federal chartering in a way to change the election of the board of directors. We've seen California go to diversity, and then New Jersey publicly say that they are considering a diversity law in their state as well. So all of this is, and that's not all. There's other issues that are happening about stock buybacks. I mean, there's a lot happening in ESG, everything. So my question to you is sort of, how does the chamber decide what issues, prioritize its issues, what issues does it need to step up on, what areas does it need to help business with?
It sort of feels like it's shooting fish in a barrel right now, doesn't it? When it comes to that. Look, we come at it from one basic premise, and then let me maybe talk about some of the issues that we're looking at here. So we look at how do policies impact the ability of a business to govern itself? And how do policies impact the ability of that business to attract the capital it needs to either get started, to grow, or expand? And with that, I mean, we've seen over the last 20 or so years a steep decline in the number of public companies. That has been arrested somewhat since 2013. That's stabilized. But we're also seeing a number of corporate governance issues really start to rise to the forefront. So with that, you mentioned the legislation that Senator Warren from Massachusetts introduced. That brings some very unique concepts, at least for the United States, into the debate. What it also does, though, politically, is that it also creates or puts a target on public companies' backs for the 2020 presidential election. So we're not only going to be dealing with these issues through this year, we're also going to see, I think, a political debate about public companies and their role in society next year. I think we should also, just in that context, also look at it from the vantage point that you have, let's say, the Bernie Sanders populists in the Democratic Party and let's say the Trump populist in the Republican Party that for differing reasons don't necessarily like big things either. So there's a potential that this is also going to generate interest in both parties. But when we talk about the decline of public companies, I think there are a number of inefficiencies that have been built into our public capital system. I think the SEC tried to have a robust discussion about these during the November roundtable, which I think the SEC did a very good job, not only in putting the issues out on the table, but really getting a diverse set of stakeholders speaking during the roundtable. Look, I think the way that they broke it down, you've got the proxy plumbing issues, you've got the shareholder proposals, we have proxy advisory firms. Proxy plumbing, been around for a long time, not a lot of movement, though I would actually say technology may be coming in such a way that that could solve some of those problems. Delaware passed legislation last year regarding blockchain. Shareholder proposals, we obviously would like to see some changes with resubmission thresholds, maybe also getting some more teeth back into 14A8 so that the SEC is more of an umpire than they've been, as well as proxy advisory firm reform. So for our vantage point, those are all priority issues. And we really look at what are the issues that impact the daily lives of a corporate secretary or general counsel.
So we just have a second. I'm curious there's so much happening around the diversity space.
Yep.
So quickly, I'm curious what the Chamber's position is relative to that.
This is going to surprise some people. So we worked very closely with Congresswoman Maloney 3 years ago on her bill to help promote gender diversity amongst boards. We also recently worked with Congressman Meeks on legislation he recently introduced for gender, racial, ethnic diversity on boards as well. Look, number one, it's the right thing to do. The reason why Congresswoman Maloney got involved in this is the GAO issued a report that basically said women were going to reach parity with men in 50 years. That's just not, acceptable situation. We also think it's very important for boards to reflect their workforce, their consumer base, to have a diversity, not only background, but diversity of thought on boards, because that really allows for a strong strategic direction for a company. And the third is, look, the business community needs to solve these problems. So we can either be a constructive agent of change and get to a reasonable resolution, or the danger is that change is then imposed on the business community, which is never a pleasant thing to have happen.
Well, obviously we've spent a lot of time on the show on the diversity issue, and I think gender has made great progress.
Yeah.
I think people of color, the ethnicity side, particularly Hispanics, really has a ways to go. But the problem is it's tough. It's much as soon as gender is easy to track, the others aren't so easy to track. So, so you were asked to testify at the SEC roundtable. So can you give a quick synopsis of sort of what your position was as a chamber in those comments?
Sure, and we actually have testified twice at the Senate Banking Committee since then as well on corporate governance issues as well. We wanted to make sure that we pressed forward on a couple of issues. One was on proxy advisory firm reform. Look, if we were creating a proxy system from scratch today, with the number of different firms that an institutional investor has to invest in, you'd probably have to create a proxy advisory firm or firms. The fact of the matter is, with the scales of economy that exist within the advice industry, it's pretty tough to get competition there, so which means you need oversight. It's very similar to, let's say, where credit ratings were several years ago. I think the changes that we are looking for are transparency of process, that there's an ability to correct mistakes, but more importantly, that the information that the advisory firms are putting out is directly linked to the fiduciary responsibility of the institutional investors to their investors. So basically that we're looking at economic return. I think Jay Clayton in his December 6th speech up in New York really laid out some thoughts about where he thinks proxy advisory firm reform is going to go. They've also have announced that Commissioner Roisman is going to be a point person on this. So I think the SEC is actually looking at this in a very constructive way. With shareholder proposals, we've had issues with resubmission thresholds. We have, repetitive shareholder proposals that are out there that have lower declining support. We have the gadfly investors, we call them, that constitute 40% of the shareholder proposals in the S&P 250. If 85% of shareholders are repeatedly rejecting a proposal, at some point in time the will of the majority needs to mean something. And they should have, maybe those proposals have to have a timeout. And there's also consequence and cost that goes with this. It's also directly linked, frankly, with proxy advisory firms, because ISS's voting power, even if you take it on the low end of academic studies, is 15%, which is enough to keep it above the current thresholds. And they frankly support repetitive proposals at a rate of about 80% plus. So we think that the Arthur Levitt proposal from '97 in terms of modernizing the resubmission threshold is important. Those original rules were put in place in 1954, and as I said during the roundtable, there was the seminal New York Railroad stockholder revolt in 1954, and if you fast forward to today, institutional investors made up 20% of the investor base in 1954. It's now 80%. So we need to make sure that we have rules that match the times.
Yeah. Well, there's no question that the most emotional one is the proxy advisor.
There's a lot of discussion on that.
Yeah. So we'll see how it all shakes out. And I tip my hat to the SEC as well. I think getting everybody together, hearing all the views, is the right way to do this. And let's see what shakes out.
And look, I would expect we wouldn't get everything that we would want. And we think it's more important for the SEC to get this right and to really have a reasonable balance system in place.
Yeah. So we got about 3 minutes left here, and I just wanted to ask you a question that I've been asking a lot of the investors that are here, and that is, so, the large institutional investors, the BlackRocks, the State Streets, the Vanguards, all of them certainly have their own process on how they're going to manage things. Yeah, they might get a little affected by politics, but I think they really have a long-range plan of what they want to do, and they're doing their best to do that. We are seeing some very aggressive tactics, if you will, like voting against directors and stuff that we've never seen in the past. But now we're seeing that. In some cases, it's changing behavior in the boardroom, proxy access, private ordering is an example, and now the diversity, voting against directors who don't have diverse boards. Nobody's going to argue that, but they're understanding their power, through vote. You tip your hat to that, and you understand, that these are the owners, quote, of the companies, but at the same time, it sort of gives pause to where's the check and balance? We always, if we look back in time, we see that pendulum going back and forth in time when things happen. But now it seems like the pendulum could swing further with all that's going on. So I'll ask you, where's the check and balance? How do we make sure that the pendulum is not swinging too far either way?
First off, I think with those large institutional investors, they have their independent analyses units. They go through economic return, I think, very stringently. In fact, people looked a lot at Larry Fink's letter last year about, he's talking about being a good corporate citizen or whatever. Yet when you look at his letter this year, he's still talking about being a good corporate citizen, but he's also talking about we need to make sure that companies are profitable, right? Look, I think investors have a very important role in making sure that the pendulum doesn't swing too far. I think companies have an important part there too. I think policymakers in Washington need to be very careful as well, because when we talked a little bit about Elizabeth Warren's bill, part of it is, one is to create a national charter, another is to have workers elect 40% of the board members. That would radically change not only our incorporation system, but it would make boards look like they do in France and Germany, where they're also susceptible to political pressure. So I think the diverse system that we've had, which has been state-based, has been very important. I think companies need to have the flexibility to have the structures that they need. And I think we all need to understand that if we break that system, we're going to do some major damage to the economy. So I think we also, as voters who vote people in or out, need to think very strongly about that too, if we're going to have that debate in the presidential elections next year.
Which I'm sure we will.
Yep.
So Tom, it's always a pleasure to have you back and hear what the Chamber's working on. The next couple months, I think, are going to be very interesting, and as a lot of this stuff shakes out and what happens. So I wanted to thank you for taking the time to come join us, and we'll have you back again for an update not too long from now.
Look forward to it.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week to take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardroom. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, Diligent, PwC, Center for Audit Quality, Spencer Stewart, the Conference Board, and corporate board member, along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.